You won't regret reading the Peter O'Keefe detective series by Dan Flanagan. He's not only a lawyer, but also a friend of mine and a talented writer. Book Life Publishers Weekly raved, saying that these crime novels are full of noir mood, action scenes, and unexpected twists. His main character, Peter O'Keefe, is an ex-soldier who became a private detective. O'Keefe investigates all sorts of crimes, from financial frauds to mafia hits. Dan's book, The Big Tilt, received 2 prestigious awards for crime fiction. This series is a gem. Find the link in the show notes. Well, welcome all you wiretappers out there, back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. In the studio with me via Zoom, Ron Freed. Now, Ronald K. Freed has written a book about the prime minister of the underworld, and he was an immensely important man in that transition from the old Mustache Pete days on into the modern crime syndicate. He was kind of, I'd say, the brains behind Lucky Luciano, in my opinion. But anyhow, Ronald's written a book about the prime minister of the underworld. So, Ron, welcome.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
So tell me, I know this is a novel. It's a novelized form, but it's based on facts.
Right.
How did you go about, how do you go about doing that? Translating facts into the novelization form.
Well, one of the things that I noticed, I worked on a TV show about the history of organized crime, about founding of the New York Mafia. What I noticed is that a lot of the mistakes, historical errors or rumors or myths or plain old nonsense from one book to the next book to the next book get repeated and repeated and repeated. So I thought it was really hard to get at the truth for a number of reasons. One is that it's not as though like the history department at Harvard University has studied this and figured out exactly what happened. The other problem is that all the people who were there when these events unfolded were actually criminals, right? And one thing we know about criminals is they lie a lot, right? They do not tell the truth. And they make up stories, and they're very self-aggrandizing. When you're dealing with the history of the organized crime, particularly in those sort of mythical days of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, there's a lot of exaggeration, there's a lot of lies, and there's a lot of nonsense. People want to believe things that simply aren't true. So I thought that a novel would be one way to try to get at the truth. However, I wanted it to be historically accurate. So what I did was I wrote a novel in which everything that Frank Costello says on the record, he actually said. So what he said in court, what he said in interviews, and what he said in the Keefe overhearings, televised congressional hearings about organized crime in America. That's all. Those are actually his words. He gave interviews. He held a press conference. This is a guy who loved to testify, who loved to talk about himself. So there was a considerable record. And then the things that he says in private to Meyer Lansky, to Joe Adonis, to his wife, that was all invented, or his inner thoughts. What he thought about Frank Hogan, what he thought about Thomas Dewey, these people who were prosecuting him, what he thought of the congressmen and the senators who were confronting him on television. That I made up, but I think that having studied Frank Costello quite a bit, I hope that it's somewhat accurate to. It's a plausible version of what he might have been thinking, what made him angry, what he resented, and what he was proud of. But the idea of the novel is that Frank is older here, and he's looking back, and he's trying to tell the truth. And you could ask, was Frank Costello capable of telling the truth? I don't know, because he did at one point agree to write a memoir with Peter Maas, right? And they met. And this is before Costello died, and they were ready to get going. But what Peter Maas said afterwards is that Costello just wanted to talk about how legitimate he was. I mean, that was one of the things about Frank Costello. He had his foot in two worlds, right? So Frank Costello was both, after Lucky Luciano was first imprisoned and then deported, Frank Costello was the acting head of the Genovese crime family. That was one hat that he wore. But he wore another hat, which is that he was very politically powerful. He was, in a sense, the head of Tammany Hall, which is the Democratic Party, which in New York City politics means a lot. So that he could veto the nomination of a judge. He could make sure that someone that he approved of became the boss of Tammany Hall. And when Frank Costello held a fundraiser trying to prove his legitimacy for the Salvation Army, congressmen, senators, judges, they all had to come because Frank invited them. But at that same party, Vito Genovese was there. So it was these two worlds coming together. And what's interesting about Costello is that he had that fundraiser. So why did he have that fundraiser? Because he wanted to think of himself as a legitimate citizen, right? But what happened? It backfired on him, as many of those efforts to be legitimate did, because once word leaked out that Frank Costello had thrown this fundraiser at the Copacabana, which he secretly controlled, the newspapers loved the story. So it was all over the tabloids, and he was embarrassed. And ultimately, the Salvation Army had to, sort of backpedal and distance themselves from Frank Costello. And that's what interested me about Costello, was his desire to seem like a legitimate person. That struck me as interesting, sort of poignant, really. I was interested in how that backfired on him and led him to make decisions which, objectively were not good decisions. If what you want to do as the head of Genevieve's crime family is keep your head down, not be written about, be ignored, stay under the radar, don't put your finger in the eye of prosecutors who really want to put you in jail. That's a long answer to one question.
Yeah, well, that was a good one, though. It explains a lot about Frank Costello and his public persona. Yeah, he was really public at the time, and the politics, how powerful he was politically, and why was that? He was holding fundraisers for the Salvation Army and things like that. So he was also. He knew the power of the dollar. I imagine he was giving a lot of money to New York politicians.
One of the things, what happened is, as I'm sure you know, right? Without prohibition, no huge amount of organizing, no mafia, no American mafia,
no money.
Prohibition was a really bad piece of legislation in any number of ways. For one thing, it corrupted all the police officers in big cities, right? Because they didn't want to enforce these rules, right? It corrupted citizens, right? Because it turned a citizen who just wanted a beer into a lawbreaker, right? So it spread corruption. And one thing that Frank Costello did, he was a corrupter. So he continued that tradition by corrupting politicians and judges. And how did he do it? He did it with all the money that the mob had from prohibition. So they used that money to, in a way, purchase political influence. It wasn't like a fundraiser today. They had the threat of violence behind everything that they said and did, and that really, there's a line in the novel that money is greed is a powerful thing, but so is fear. So they had both things working for them, because Frank Costello didn't have to even make an explicit threat; it was understood.
He was a corrupter, and how he corrupted people after Prohibition was over was with slot machines, because people like to gamble as well as drink. So now gambling is still illegal. And so he really got into the slot machines, the slot business big time, which continued. Policemen don't really like to enforce gambling laws because they like to gamble. And, politicians don't like to enforce and pass gambling laws, particularly because they like to gamble. But there's always a group of citizens out there that think that gambling should be illegal and should not be available. It's all over the place now. We got guys that spend a lot of time for sports gambling. Now every state practically has sports gambling legalized, as well as the casinos. As he got into that, then he must have lost some political power, because LaGuardia cracked down on the slots and drove him really out of New York. So how did he lose that?
Into New Orleans. So there were slot machines in candy stores all over, small stores, mom and pop stores all over the city. And they're called one-armed bandits. And one of my favorite little facts about this was that in order to get money from children, one of Costello's ideas is he put a step in front of the slot machines so the little kid could stand on it and could reach the slots and put his coins in. What's interesting about LaGuardia is that LaGuardia was not a part of Tammany Hall, right? He wasn't a Democrat, right? He ran as a Republican/independent. So he wasn't a part of Frank Costello. He ran, in a sense, in opposition to Frank Costello's political machine. And it's interesting that the things you just mentioned, alcohol, Costello's in the alcohol business, gambling. Costello was in the gambling business, essentially juice loans, right? Loan sharking, right? Well, what are the credit card companies charge now, right? 25% interest on your purchase of a sofa. I mean, so many of these things that were criminalized in Frank Costello's day are legal now. So in a sense, that legislation created an opportunity for someone like Frank Costello or any of the other gangsters. There's actually a line in the novel I put in to sort of amuse myself, which is the lawyer, Frank Costello, says something like, "Well, why don't they just legalize it?" And his lawyers, they'll never legalize like off-track betting. That'll never happen in the United States. Well, it all happened, Anyway, really. So after LaGuardia made a big show out of cracking down on the slots, Costello moved his slot machines down to New Orleans, and he sent his brother-in-law down there to oversee the operation, along with some of his other gambling cronies who he'd worked with in New York.
Costello?
Yes, exactly.
Phil Costello was his brother.
Dandy Phil Costello was his partner in gambling. His brother-in-law was someone else, but who went down to New Orleans and worked in that. He also opened a casino outside of I think the limits of New Orleans, so he was able to run a fairly high-end casino there. But I think he had to cut in the bosses in New Orleans as well. And then Huey Long, who was, I don't know, I guess he was the governor of the center at that time, I'm not really sure. He had to get a piece of the action. So supposedly Dandy Phil Costello made sure that every month in a lockbox in a hotel, there was a certain amount of cash available for the governor or the senator, or whatever he wants to pick up at that time.
Now, you mentioned Huey P. Long.
Yeah.
Did you run across that story about how Costello saved him from a beating in a bathroom?
Yes.
Country club?
Yes. I don't know whether that's true, but it gets repeated a lot. One thing I didn't put, speaking of men's rooms, I don't know if you can use this now, but it's pretty fun. I didn't put this in, but Costello, he liked to gamble about everything. Basically, if he didn't have a bet on a ball game or a fight or whatever, he didn't feel like he was in the action. So he almost needed that to feel alive. And he bet a lot of money. One of the things he did was he would bet with his friends on who could pee for the longest, for lack of a better phrase of putting it. He had this whole method for how he did it. Like, you don't drink a lot of water beforehand, you drink some. And he said that a lot of men have pissed away a fortune. I'm the only man who made a fortune pissing.
I had not heard that story before. That's a good one.
Yeah, you stick with me. I'll give you all the highbrow stuff.
Really? So down in New Orleans, he's operating down there, but he has people down there. So does he establish any kind of residence, or does he stay in New York? He's a born and bred New Yorker, famous for sitting around up the Upper East Side, having an apartment and sitting in Central Park. And I think to Louisiana.
He went back and forth, but no, he didn't really live there. I mean, he trusted Phil Costello, and it was a successful operation. He also had interest in Meyer Lansky's casinos in Broward County in Florida. So I think he would go down there just to check on his business. And then later, of course, in New Orleans, I beg your pardon, in Las Vegas. But then, he couldn't really speak on the phone that much because his phone was tapped. And that's how he got into a lot of trouble because of the wiretaps on his phone.
Wiretaps, there was no wiretap law one way or the other back in those days. So those would all were able to use those. And did you find those in court files, actual transcripts, or?
Well, I actually didn't dig into I didn't read the transcripts of his phone calls, but there are some famous passages that I didn't incorporate. And the most famous thing is that he got a call from a judge named Aurelio, who had just been promoted from magistrate to be nominated for both parties. This indicates how much power he had to be on the Supreme Court of the state of New York. So Aurelio, who had come to see Costello previously to ask for his help, calls Frank Costello and says, and Frank Costello said, he says, "I want to thank you, and I pledge my undying loyalty." And Frank Costello says, "When I tell you something is in the bag, it's in the bag." The New York District Attorney, Frank Hogan, made sure that was in the newspapers. That was a huge scandal. And then there was a public hearing about it, whether or not to disbar Aurelio to take away his nomination. And Costello was called to testify. When he testified, he bragged about all of his legitimate friends But then he didn't deny that he knew all these other people like Al Capone and Lucky Luciano, et cetera, et cetera. And when he was finished, his lawyer, George Wolfe, turned to him and said, "You love it, don't you? You love to testify." And he did. He loved to sort of get out there and brag. That's what got him into trouble. And later in life, he would give interviews. One amazing thing that I came across is that, they were really after him, both the federal government, that era's version of the Drug Enforcement Administration, as well as Frank Hogan in New York. They were really after Costello. And so they put out a story that he was in charge of importing heroin into New York. He had sort of famously stated that he loathed the drug industry, illegal drugs, and he wasn't involved in it. So he held a press conference, and I had the transcript of the press conference. The amazing thing about the press conference is that he puts himself out there, and he's going to deny it, and he somehow thinks that this is going to be good for his reputation. But in fact, he's incredibly vulnerable because he can't answer half the questions. Do you know what I mean? Like, were you the biggest owner of slot? Did you run more slot machines than anyone else in New York? Well, I wouldn't say that. I don't know anything about this thing they call the Mafia. So he really, and they would ask him specific questions, and you go, I'd prefer not to say. I don't want to. I think that he was vulnerable in ways that he didn't understand or was in denial about. So I think that he had a certain amount of a naivete about where he stood in society. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I think that perhaps had to do with being an immigrant, and that, in a sense, brought his downfall. And to me, that was the crux of the story. And you see that. And the real reason I wrote the book was I was really fascinated with, why did he agree to testify on OKeefe over here? Because others that just took the fifth, and they're not going to talk about it. But Costello thinks, well, I can talk to these people. I'm one of them. I hobnobbed in New York with all these judges. I'm going to talk to them. But he didn't understand how vulnerable he was, as I just said. And there was something else that made it fascinating to me, is that these were the first major congressional hearings that were televised, right? And no one at that point really understood the power of television as a new medium. But it was a complete sensation. People weren't going to the movies. They were watching it on television. And when people went to television, went to the movies, they didn't want to see what the movie was. They said, put the TV on. We want to see Frank Costello testify. Department stores were saying open late because people were watching this live on television, and it was coast to coast. He became a star when he really didn't want to be a star.
In today's world, he's most famous for that line.
You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as American citizens. If so, what are they? Paid my tax.
And then when they laugh, he looks surprised.
Yeah.
And that's why I wrote the novel. And afterward, where you see what happened to him afterward. But it was to get to that point, and that's in a sense where the novel ends. There's an afterwards, which shows you what happened to Frank Costello. But to me, the drama of that and how he sort of wised up about where he really is in American society, that's why I wrote the novel. And that's why I decided to tell it in the first person, because I wanted to imagine what his inner voice might be like, what he was feeling, what he was thinking, how much he hated those congressmen, how much he resented them, how much he thought, and I know that this to be true, that had he been born elsewhere, he would have had a very different life because he was very gifted. He ran an immense bootlegging operation, importing enormous amounts of booze into this country. It was very complicated. He had, a shipping empire really to bring the booze in. He had airplanes to track where the Coast Guard was. They were bribing the Coast Guard in a very elaborate way. I mean, it was a pretty brilliant operation that he had going. So, he always thought, might he have used that talent elsewhere? Could he run a corporation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And to me, that's what made him vulnerable. And if the character is vulnerable, then he's interesting because he's got two sides to him. That makes the story interesting.
Really, for me, that's what has always drawn me to the Mafia and the men in it that run it, is that if take them out of that criminal organization and put them into legitimate business, they'd be successful. I've met this guy that here in Kansas City that went to jail for a little drug ring he had, and I've gotten to know him since he got back.
Oh, yeah.
He's connected, and he got now. legitimate loan sharking, but it's a buy here, pay here car business, and they charge huge amounts of money on that. But poor people, I mean, that's the only way they can get a car, and you got to have a car in Kansas City. And he made really good money, and now he's retired from that and doesn't have to work. I mean, I told him, I said, if you'd have just done this back in 1990, you wouldn't have spent 12 years in the penitentiary, and you'd be a multi-million. I know. I've learned my lesson. So,
well, yeah, but there are folks like that, and then there are gangsters who sociopaths, and
really Genovese comes along,
really, who you wouldn't want living next to you, or Dutch Schultz, who really was. I mean, these people were serial killers. Yeah. I mean, they really were. They had no empathy for their victims. And
he's an interesting guy, never ending, bunch of stories about him. He's complicated and working both levels. He was the first guy that was really skimming out of Las Vegas that we found out about. And, that was before Las Vegas was Las Vegas in a way. Right. It wasn't really anything to anybody outside of the few mob guys that had the foresight to invest in that casino out there. The first casino, the Flamingo, some of the others. So it's, And that's been for years. That was their lifeblood. That skimming out of casinos and gambling money has been their lifeblood. Now that it's all legal, I don't know where they make their money now. I hear from internet scams, but I don't know. All right, Ronald K. Freed. It's Frank Costello, a novel. That the correct title?
That is correct.
Ronald K. Freed, thanks a lot for showing up and imparting your wisdom about your knowledge about one of the more important figures of the early transition of organized crime from the Black Handers to the National Crime Syndicate. Without men like Frank Costello, it might not have made that transition and made so much money during the Prohibition. So he's an interesting guy.
Thank you, Gary. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate it.
Well, guys, I ride motorcycles, and don't forget, look out for motorcycles when you're out there on the streets. And if you or your friends or relatives or somebody has a problem with PTSD, if they've been in the service, go to the VA website and get that hotline. There's help available. Okay, thanks a lot, Ronald.
Thanks, Gary. I appreciate it. Gary, I appreciate it.